Hello, welcome to the Mental Health and Journalism Summit. My name's Emma Thomason. I'm a trainer and a coach working with the self-investigation. And sorry, I'm just having some problems with my slides. Just 1 second, I will share them again. There we go. So it's been so amazing so far. This summit is being organised by the Self-Investigation, a global non-profit in collaboration with the Fred Foundation, as well as all of these amazing partners. So thank you very much for everybody who's been working on this. Also behind the scenes, lots of volunteers, lots of speakers. So this is day 3. On the first day, we talked about why mental health is such an urgent issue in the media. We talked about what's being done. We're on it. So many things are happening all around the world. And today, day 3, we're looking ahead and focusing on leadership and duty of care. It's also World Mental Health Day. And it's, so relevant because the topic of this year's World Mental Health Day is mental health in the workplace. So it's a perfect time for us to be talking about this subject in the media industry. Please follow us on social media, use this hashtag to share your insights, and just be ready to see the great program that we've got for the rest of the day. First up, our keynote speech is about moral injury and moral courage. And we've got these fantastic speakers, Anthony Feinstein, Professor of Psychiatry from the University of Toronto, who's been working in the field of journalism and mental health for 25 years. He's a real pioneer here. And he's going to be in conversation with Shephard, who's a journalist, filmmaker. And they're both joining us from Toronto very early in the morning. So I'm really excited to hear from both of them and talk about this subject of moral injury. It's not well understood, and Anthony Feinstein has been really a pioneer in this area. So I'm going to hand over to Anthony and Michelle, and I'm really excited to listen to what they've got to say. Thank you very much, both of you.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you, Emma. As Emma said, we're coming in from Toronto in this global conference. So I apologize. I either have morning voice or I'm coming down with a cold, but hopefully you can hear me okay. It's my absolute pleasure to be here today and to help guide this discussion with Anthony. And as Emma said, he pioneers such a good word. He has really been a leader in this field of studying and helping journalists in terms of mental health. Anthony, welcome.
Yeah, thank you.
Why don't we start with just tell us how you actually got involved in this field, and because this is not your day job, actually.
Mm-hmm. Correct. So I'm a clinician researcher. I have a clinical practice 2 days a week, but I also run a research lab, which is basically a neuroscience lab. And much of our research focuses on a disease called multiple sclerosis. But in 1999, a patient was sent to my clinic who had a very interesting presentation. They initially thought she'd had a stroke. She was having difficulty speaking. Her level of consciousness was a little reduced, but there were atypical clinical features. And after extensive investigation, they couldn't find evidence of a stroke. And the conclusion was that she was having an extreme stress reaction. So that's why she came to my clinic. She did very well with therapy, and she turned out to be a frontline journalist. And I was intrigued by her clinical history. She told me she'd been working in East Africa. She'd been covering the famine. Her cameraman had been killed. She'd seen a lot of death and dying, and she'd become increasingly distressed while out in the field. But she never reached out for help. She started to self-medicate with alcohol. And when she came back to Toronto, she had this very significant mental breakdown. And I remember saying to her, you work for a big news organization. Why had you not reached out for assistance? You could see yourself getting into trouble. And she said to me, remember this was back in May 1999, she said to me, you don't understand this profession. That if I tell my editors and my boss I'm feeling this way, they will pull me from the field. I will not get sent back. And I love my work. My work gives me great meaning. So she was fearful of losing her career by divulging the fact that she was feeling distressed. So this was obviously a very punitive way of looking at her career, and that intrigued me as well. And I remember saying to my research team, I've had this fascinating patient. Let's find out what's been written about journalism and mental health. And so we did a deep dive into the literature, and there's an enormous trauma literature looking at, soldiers, veterans, victims of assault, rape, etc. But we couldn't find a single publication of journalists. There wasn't one, which was a striking observation. There was not a single publication written on this topic. And so I wrote a grant application because I was intrigued by this. And I sent it to the Freedom Forum in Washington, D.C. And I said, do you know that in your profession, there isn't a single article or any kind of data on journalism and mental health? And they wrote back and said, no, we don't know this, but this is fascinating. And they funded the study. And that started me on this journey. So I got funding from a foundation to start this work.
It's incredible to think how far we've come to have a conference such as this, and so many different programs now. We're going to talk about a couple terms today. And actually, before we get there, I just want to remind people who are watching that if you do want to have questions, please, throughout our conversation, type in the questions, and then we'll leave some time at the end to answer them. So just please go ahead and do that. I've been told there's a little bit of a delay online, so it's best to get the questions in early so we don't miss them. Anthony, we're going to talk about a couple terms when dealing with mental health and journalism today. Let's start by just defining them for people, the name of our session. Can you tell me what moral injury is as it pertains to journalism?
Right. So the definition I like, there are a couple of definitions, but the one that I like, it's a condition that can arise from witnessing, perpetrating, or failing to prevent acts that transgress your moral compass. So it can come out from things that you do or other people do, acts of commission, or things that you fail to do, acts of omission. And this transgresses your moral compass. And as a result, you can end up with negative emotions, typically shame and guilt. And in the case of journalists, anger as well, maybe disgust. So these are uncomfortable emotions to carry around with you. Very important to note that moral injury is not a mental illness. It's not classified as a mental illness, and I'm glad it's not. But it can certainly become the conduit to significant mental illness, such as depression or post-traumatic stress disorder, which I could define for you if you want as well.
Before we get to PTSD, can you give us an example of how this might play out, an example for a journalist when they might feel something like that?
Yeah. So I'll give you a typical example. Photographers go into a war zone, and they see people who have lost everything, tremendous destruction, extreme distress, and they take photographs of the victims of war. And then they come back, and these photographs are incredible, and they end up with an award. And the photographers feel guilty. They feel that they're benefiting off the suffering of other people. And I've had patients who've come to me saying they feel guilty, that they're being rewarded, and they feel that they've, stuck their lens into the face of extreme suffering, and now they're getting rewarded for it. And of course, this is a cognitive distortion. It's a false belief. But it doesn't stop them feeling this way. And so through therapy, you explain to them, your job as a journalist is to tell the story, to tell it well. The fact that people recognize that you've told it well is an important accolade. It shouldn't be the source of guilt. If you don't tell the story, who's going to tell it? If you don't photograph it, who's going to know about it? So you have to start correcting these distortions that lie at the root of something like moral injury. So there's a classic example. They feel that they've transgressed their moral compass, and they feel shame and guilt as a result. And that's
I certainly can have recall examples of being somewhere where you also want to do more for people. You're reporting on these tragedies, and you feel, terrible that you're there writing things down or taking pictures, as you say.
Yeah, and I can give you another example of that, because that's what got me interested in moral injury with journalists. So Hannah Storm, a colleague of mine, we did a study about 5-6 years back looking at journalists covering the migration crisis in Europe. It was a study funded by International News Safety Institute, and about 7 or 8 news organizations took part. And we didn't find high levels of PTSD or depression in the journalists, but we found moral injury for the very reason that you just highlighted. So there would be a journalist, for example, on a beach in southern Italy, and there are no first responders, and there's a boat that washes ashore. And then what's your role? Are you there to take the photograph or to tell the story? Or are you there to try and help people who might not be able to swim, who are hungry, who are thirsty? What do you do? And, journalists will say, well, you put your humanity first and you try and help people. But then there might be an editor sitting all the way back in Toronto and New York saying, hey, you never got the picture. You never got the story. So there's this disconnect between the journalist and, the newsroom. And these things hadn't been discussed in advance. So journalists were having to make, very difficult, morally fraught decisions in real time. The stakes were very high, and they felt they got it wrong at times. And that became the conduit to moral injury. They felt that they, transgressed their own moral compass. The editors had, done things that were morally wrong. The news organization had, crossed some kind of moral boundary. So the whole thing became very fraught from a moral perspective.
Right. And you mentioned earlier that moral injury is not post-traumatic stress disorder, and it's not classified as a mental illness, and you're glad about that. Yes. Can you explain, first of all, why you're happy it's not classified as such, and then what the distinction is with PTSD?
I think there's this creeping annexation of normal life by psychiatric classification. That's a very big topic. I think we don't want to pathologize things excessively. And I think the moment it has the label of mental illness, it comes with a certain stigma and it becomes harder to deal with, etc. So the fact that it's not, I think, is very helpful. It's very different from post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a significant mental illness. And there are very clear criteria for PTSD, which are different from moral injury. You have the extreme stressor that you have to report on, the event that killed other people, that could have killed you. And then in response to that, you might have your intrusion symptoms, your re-experiencing symptoms of flashbacks, nightmares, unwanted memories. You've got the avoidance symptoms of wanting to stay away from recollections of the trauma or a sense of emotional numbing. You've got the arousal of your autonomic nervous system, which makes it difficult for you to concentrate, and you're irritable, and you have a prominent startle response, and you're hypervigilant when you come back to a safe place. And then you have the fourth group of symptoms, which is you anticipate future misfortune. Things that you formerly enjoyed now have a negative connotation because you think there's going to be some misfortune. So those are the symptoms of PTSD, very different from moral injury and a very significant mental illness.
I imagine, though, moral injury could lead to PTSD at some point. Yes. There must be some correlation. Okay. Exactly. And then a newer term, I know this is one that we've talked about just recently but before that I hadn't heard of it, which is moral courage. Can you define that for us? Yeah,
so I think moral courage for me is fascinating because I think it becomes a very powerful motivating factor for some people. But the ingredients for moral courage have been defined by a researcher called Rushworth-Kidder. And there are three variables. One is there has to be the element of risk or danger. Then there's got to be the person's moral compass, which we've spoken about already, a strong moral compass. And then the third ingredient is agency or action. You've got to do something about it. And so you've got to have the three variables. If you have only two, you don't have moral courage. So, for example, there can be danger. You can have a strong moral compass, but you don't do anything. So you're timid. That's not moral courage. You might have danger. And you do something about it, but there's no moral compass. Well, that's physical courage, not moral courage. And then you might have the third combination is you might have agency. You do something about it, and you've got a strong moral compass, but there's no danger. Well, then you don't need the courage for that. So you've got to have those three variables. And when three variables coincide in one person, you've got the foundation of moral courage. And like anything in my profession, in mental health, it's distributed along a continuum. Right. There'll be some people with minimal moral courage and other people with extreme, marked moral courage. And there are some journalists who have that very profound moral courage, which allows them to do this remarkable work.
So that was going to be my question. Like, why is this an important term to understand? Is it in understanding the motivations of why investigative journalists or journalists who put themselves in dangerous situations, why they do that?
Yeah. So my theory is that moral courage can become the antidote to moral injury. And so if you're experiencing moral injury and you see things that you feel have transgressed your moral compass, you feel bad about it, then you want to do something about it. And if you don't do something about it, it becomes an act of omission, which kind of magnifies your moral injury. But when you do something about it, it becomes the balm to your moral injury. So when you've got strong, entrenched moral courage, it can keep moral injury at bay. And of course, the motivation is complex. You're not going to boil it down to a single factor. It's all about moral courage. But I think moral courage is pivotal in the lives of certain journalists who take on extreme risk to report on stories that they feel compelled to tell.
Right. And this is a good segue to your latest book, which is Moral Courage, right there, 19 Profiles of Investigative Journalists. And I encourage anyone watching to buy it. It's just an extraordinary book telling the lives, the stories of these incredible journalists. We won't have time to go through all their stories, but I would like to highlight just a few because I think their stories help us learn about these issues in general. So I think we have a slide of Neha. Do you want to tell me her story?
Yeah, so the Indian journalist Neha Dixit, she focuses on, she lives in India, and just to remind everyone that India regards itself as the world's biggest democracy, but it's a very difficult place in terms of freedom of expression, and there's a lot of intolerance and misogyny in Indian society. And she focuses on stories like child brides and honor killings and the way women are treated in India. And that causes a lot of anger in Hindu nationalists in particular. Other stories that she's done is she would go after big pharma who have done drug trials using patients in mental institutions who aren't able to give informed consent. She's also covered riots in India, sectarian riots in which vast numbers of people have been displaced. The Muslim minority has been persecuted. There have been mass rapes. So she reports on stories that really get under the skin of the Hindu nationalists. And they've responded by intense online harassment, very vicious online harassment with a very nasty, ugly sexual connotation to the harassment as well. But she refuses to back down. She refuses to bend to it. She feels compelled to tell these stories. They've also tried to break her through quasi-legal means by charging her with bogus things, and then she has to appear in court. And then these cases run on for years and years. And in one instance, she's got to appear in court every 2 months, and then make sure that the courtroom is 2,000 miles away from where she lives. So she's got to travel there. If she doesn't go there, she'll be arrested. And yet she still, doesn't buckle. She still has to tell these stories, because if she keeps quiet, it becomes an act of omission.
Right.
And so she looks around at things going on in her society, and she says, India is not a democracy. It's a democracy if you are rich and if you're Hindu. And if you're not, those in those categories, you're going to suffer. And so she doesn't back off despite this intense harassment. People let her know that they know where her mother lives. These subtle threats will get your family. She had an apartment broken into. Her partner has been threatened. But for her, silence is not an option, because when you keep quiet, you feel ashamed, you feel guilty. And remember, shame and guilt are the symptoms of moral injury. And so you keep moral injury at bay through this remarkable moral courage.
It's such interesting advice, because I think typically in the past, if people were feeling this moral injury, the advice would be take a break. Perhaps get away from this profession, and things that journalists frankly don't want to hear, because it is their life's work and their passion. And if I'm understanding you correctly, in this case, for her own mental well-being, she has to keep working.
Yeah, that for me, that's what's really intriguing. She knows that by speaking out, she's going to get hammered online. She knows that she's going to make herself, put herself in the crosshairs of these ultra Hindu nationalists. They're going to come after her. She knows all of this. And so she knows there are going to be some grave consequences for the kind of work that I do. And she's not getting supported by her news organizations. And so she becomes a freelance. So she knows all of this in advance, and yet she still does it. Right. And as a behavioral scientist, the question that intrigues me is why? Where does this extraordinary motivation come from? And once again, motivation is going to be complex. There are going to be multiple factors. But the one that I focus on here is that when you've got this innate moral courage, it allows you to do extraordinary things.
Right. And I hope we have time to go back at the end about online abuse, because that is an interesting, relatively new issue that journalists do face. I think in the past, when you did this work, it was typically about foreign correspondence when you were starting out going abroad. Yeah. Now journalists can feel all these things and be threatened in such ways, not leaving their homes, doing reporting in some ways. So hopefully we have time for that. But I wanted to get to two other journalists who are in your book. Gwyn Lister, that'd be the next slide. There she is, yeah.
So Gwyn Lister is another remarkable journalist. She's South African, grew up during the apartheid era, and she tells us this really interesting story that as a very young person on the cusp of the teenage years, 1966 in South Africa, Cape Town. She's traveling in a bus. Because of apartheid, there's segregation. White people sit on the ground floor and black people have to sit above. And there's this kid on a bus, and an elderly black woman gets on the bus, and she's laden down with parcels. And Gwen can see she's not going to be able to make it up the stairs. And so instinctively, she stands up and she gives her seat to this black woman. And the white passengers on the ground floor are enraged. You know, how can you do this? This is breaking the law. But for her, it wasn't even debatable. She felt she was compelled to do this. And so very early in her life, you see where her moral compass is set. And she then remains true to this moral compass over the next, many decades. She, goes into journalism. She becomes a foe of apartheid. She wants to contribute to the anti-apartheid movement. She feels that she's going to be able to do it in a more meaningful way through journalism if she goes to live in the neighboring territory of Namibia, which at the time was occupied by South Africa, and there were the apartheid laws in Namibia. So she gets to Namibia, she starts working as a journalist. And because of what she's doing, she gets hammered by society. She's an outcast. When white people see her walking down the street, they would cross over to the other side of the road. She would be targeted for her work as a journalist because she saw apartheid as a grave moral insult. And so ultimately, she ends up forming her own paper, starting her own newspaper called The Namibian. And she uses it as a mechanism to promote a democratic, free society in Namibia. And ultimately, that's what comes about. But along the way, she pays a very heavy price. The offices of the Namibian are firebombed, equipment is destroyed, people would drive past and shoot at the office. She would get these late night phone calls threatening her. A colleague of hers, a lawyer, was murdered, and the message she got was, "You're next." The tremendous strain of all of this had a negative effect on her marriages, but still she refused to buckle. She was arrested, she was detained, but she stuck true to her moral compass because, like Neha, keeping silent is an act of omission.
Right.
And when you feel this moral weight of what's going on, you do not want to transgress your moral compass when you're someone like Gwen Lister. So she remains true to this. And then in 1990, when the country becomes democratic, and SWAPO takes over as the legitimate government, they then come calling on Gwen to offer her the rewards of her work. They want to, would you like an ambassadorship? Would you like to become head of the Namibian Broadcasting Corporation? And she turns it all down because she says you've got to keep a distance from power. Journalists have to keep a distance from power. And then SWAPO then views her with suspicion. But she's got this ironclad moral compass. She's just not going to bend.
And the last journalist I just wanted to profile from the book is Candido, if you want to tell his story.
Yeah.
So it's an incredible picture set here.
It is. So that's Candido in the middle with his security detail, and he's Paraguayan. And he wrote and exposed corruption in Paraguay. And he would write about the drug cartels. And then they were determined to kill him. And so for 24 years and 8 months of his life, he had to live with a constant security detail. You see 2 of them there. But there were 7 men guarding him for almost a quarter of a century. And he would not back off in terms of his reporting. It was such dangerous work that he had to cut contact with family members because he was worried that they would become vulnerable. The cartels would target them, and indeed they tried to do that. They would kill colleagues of his. He couldn't step out his front door to go for a cup of coffee. He couldn't go to a restaurant without his security detail coming with him. He couldn't even sit out on his front veranda on a balmy night because it was just unsafe. People would drive past the cartels would drive past his house and shoot at the house. And so for 24 years and 8 months, he writes about living with 7 armed guards with him all the time. The only rooms in his house that they didn't go into were his bedroom and his washroom. And so, where does this resolve come from? Where do you get this iron will to do this? And once again, like Neha and Gwen, silence is not an option. When you keep silent, you feel guilty, you feel ashamed. These are emotions that you don't want to feel. And so by speaking out and showing this moral courage, you pay a terrible price. But from a psychological perspective, you feel good about yourself. That's what all these journalists tell me. They feel good about themselves because they are making a stand. They feel that they've been true to their moral compass.
It does get, you raise the issue of family though. It does get difficult when you realize your work is not just impacting yourself.
Yeah, that's very true. And the classic example of that, I think, is the Russian journalist Anna Politkovskaya, who is in my book. But I mean, she took on Vladimir Putin and the Russian regime in a very aggressive, militant way. And family would implore her just to back off a little because they were so concerned. But she wouldn't, and ultimately, she was murdered. She was killed on Putin's birthday, and then, of course, the family is left with the trauma of that. It can be so deeply distressing. Yeah.
I think a lot of what you're saying is resonating with people who are listening. I'm just looking at one of the comments here that's come in from Olga, and she writes that in crisis times, work is actually often a source of strength for journalists because it gives the vital feeling that you can do something meaningful and helpful. And I think it's interesting because I think inherently we all know that when we're doing it, it's you feel when you're actually just consuming news as a reader or a viewer, it's actually an uneasy feeling. When you're actually working and doing something, it does give you meaning. I'm not sure we had a name for it before, though.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's right. I think this work is very meaningful, and I think that that meaning gives individuals this courage to go on, to keep doing it, because if they don't, who's going to do it? I mean, when you look at the journalists who I've profiled, they are often the last vestiges of civil society. The dictatorial regimes have shelled out civil society. The law courts are gone. The judiciary's gone. The NGOs have been run out the country. Who's left? The media has been cowed into silence, except for this handful of remarkable journalists who will not be silenced.
And we're certainly seeing that around the world right now when media is under attack. And despite this fact that it gives us meaning and we can go on as journalists because of this moral courage, it's still pretty difficult. I know you have a lot of journalists that you see and help talk them through it. What are some, we only have a few minutes left. I know you can't have here's your top 5 tools, but is there any advice or some ways to help journalists cope with this, those who are watching and are struggling with how to keep going?
Yeah.
And if you want to refer to sort of some of the online abuse that we're talking about too, what are some best practices?
Yeah, so I think education is really key to everything. To understand what moral injury is, to have an appreciation of what it is. Because if you don't, the very basic step is missing, then you're not going to be able to deal with it. So understand what moral injury is. Understand that it's not a mental illness. I believe it's very common in journalism. I think it's much more common than PTSD. And it comes with potentially negative consequences. It's not just the emotions of shame or guilt or anger, but it can lead to a sense of cynicism about your profession, about society in general. It can alienate you from your work. It can lead to complications in your social relationships, etc. So be aware of the ramifications of it, but also be aware that it's something that can be addressed. And what in my work with journalists, I reinforce the importance of journalism to civil society, why it's so essential that these stories are told, that without having a free, vibrant press, without journalists bringing us the news of what's going on, we don't really have a civil society. And so this work, I impress on them the importance of what you're doing. And then also to emphasize that be careful of, no good deed goes unpunished. Don't stray too far from your discipline because you're so worried about, society at large. You step out of your role as a journalist and start working as a social worker, for example. You're not trained for that. Right. And you can get into difficulties with that. And that's what we saw with our study looking at the migration crisis, that when journalists stopped working as journalists and took on the mantle of, first responder, social worker, aid worker, they got into difficulty. They weren't trained for that. And that made them feel morally bad. They felt a sense of failure. I can't fix this problem. The problem's too big, and they felt overwhelmed, and moral injury became a major challenge for them. So understand the parameters of what you're doing, understand the importance of why you're doing it. And finally, if you feel distressed, reach out for help. I think that's so important. I think one of the huge changes that I've seen over the past 25 years is that journalists are reaching out for help. And I've always, jokingly said, people go along to see their GP once a year to have your blood pressure checked and your cholesterol. You even take your car into the garage once a year to check your oil and your tires. Well, for goodness sake, have a quick mental health checkup if you're feeling anxious or distressed or emotionally, not quite right. You can have it very easily.
We're so far from where we were when you started 25 years ago, but do you think most news outlets, media organizations are dealing well with that? When you say reach out for help, do you think a lot of outlets support their journalists in that way, or do we have a long way to go still?
My sense is it depends on where you live. I think, in countries like Canada and the UK, I think that there's been a huge change. But, we've done a lot of research in the global south where this is not an issue at all. We've done studies in Kenya, and we did a study in Afghanistan, and one in Syria, even in Mexico, where there's a huge amount of trauma and stress visited on journalists, and there isn't a discussion about this. Journalists are not getting the kind of help that they need, even though they're doing such dangerous, difficult work. So I think it's a very patchy balance sheet right now, but definitely there's been progress.
We have just a few minutes left, and I'm just going to bring Emma back on because there's some questions that she's looking at. Maybe if you don't mind reading them out, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. So Louisa Vassiliou said, I heard Dr. Feinstein say that moral courage is innate, and I was curious to hear more about that. So I guess the question is that something that people can develop, or are you sort of born with it?
Well, I think like everything, it's a combination of both. I think it's nature and nurture. The good examples of people learning this, watching their parents. There's a role model for you. And I quote examples of that in my book as well. But certainly you can be taught it at school through your teachers, the way you're brought up, what kind of society you live in, where the values of society. Absolutely. These are things that can be learned. I don't want to become completely reductionist. But then I come back to this incredible story of Gwen Lister. She didn't grow up in a family in which there was a discussion about the politics of apartheid South Africa. It wasn't a political family. And then just suddenly one day, this 13-year-old kid sitting on a bus does something that's got profound moral consequences. And then she remains true to that for the next, 4 decades or whatever. So where did that come from? And I think there is an innate quality within all of us that has to be recognized. But certainly, I think it can be learned and encouraged and fostered.
I guess that's also why we don't want it to be kind of medicalized, because having a moral compass is a good thing, actually. Exactly. And somebody's actually just asking, Sally Zong mentioned, what is a moral compass? Perhaps you can just kind of define that.
Well, that's a difficult definition, but what do you regard as morally correct? What's good behavior? What's morally acceptable behavior? Some people cite religion for a reference point, other people don't. But we know generally what's right and wrong, and how to behave correctly. To obey certain societal norms that respect other people, etc. The sanctity of life, telling the truth, things like that. Those kind of moral boundaries that hopefully we learn as we grow up, that are instilled in us. And I think that those are universal, by the way. We can't say these are cultural things. They are universal. There's universal things that are correct, that are good, that people recognize. And that's what you've got to hold true to. You want to hold true to your moral compass, because if you don't, you have the sense of moral injury. And then all these negative emotions start, and they can be very uncomfortable to live with, and they can become alienating and very destructive.
There's another question here from Zen about what are the differences in terms of approaching these concepts for journalists compared with other, I guess, frontline professions like doctors and people working in humanitarian situations.
I'm so glad you asked that question, because when we did our research back in 2015-16, there was no psychometric scale to look at moral injury in journalists. So we had to borrow from the military. The military have known about moral injury for decades, going back to Vietnam, and the war in Iraq started in 2003, and the soldiers started to come home. These young men had moral injury. So we had to borrow from the military, but you can't use a military scale to study journalists. The professions are just too different. And so because of this omission, my research group in Toronto has developed the first moral injury scale for journalists, which is a 9-item simple-to-use scale, and it's in the public domain. It's available to use. And that basically looks at the unique experience of journalists in relation to their work and how this might cause moral injury. So we have now an occupation-specific moral injury scale for journalists.
And is that different because, journalists, when we're talking about action, the only action we can take is reporting, whereas I think journalists sometimes feel like they need to sort of act in some other human way. I mean, I guess a doctor gets to fix somebody, but
that's one of the challenges. Exactly. That was one of the challenges that became evident in the journalists covering the migration crisis. These journalists felt compelled to step outside their role as journalists to help someone who was thirsty, who was starving, who had no money, who couldn't swim. And that's completely understandable because you're putting your humanity first. But then where does that help end? How far does it help extend? And journalists couldn't answer that. And so they started to get into this morally, fraught area of, well, how much can I do? And beware of good intentions. Journalists would hand out the emails addresses to and suddenly they would get flooded, not by hundreds, but by thousands of emails saying, help me. And then they felt they couldn't do this, and they felt bad because they couldn't do it. And so that became, the perfect recipe for moral injury. So you do have to be very careful. I'm certainly not advocating, bottle your humanity. Absolutely not. But you've got to know, what is my role as a journalist? What's my expectation? And you need to be on the same page as the newsroom. You can't be disconnected from the newsroom or the news organization when it comes to this. Everybody has to be singing from the same sheet. Otherwise, it becomes a source of moral injury.
I wonder too, Anthony, if it can come, if I'm seeing this with some young journalists in terms of what society does. So right now, when the media is sort of challenged and people there's great distrust in the media. So those young journalists who are covering various conflicts, and then their reporting is questioned, or they feel their reporting doesn't make a difference because people are either not reading it or not believing it, or have their own opinions. Is that a risk factor now that we're seeing more?
Absolutely, that's devastating. And I see it writ large in something like climate change journalists, where these, there's very motivated group of younger journalists, view climate change as our greatest existential crisis. I think they're right. They go out and report on very difficult stories of, towns washed away, burnt to the ground. They see tremendous suffering in people who survived that. And then they're getting hammered online by climate deniers who go after them in this very vicious way. And so they feel they quite rightly see this is morally egregious behavior. And morally egregious behavior, by definition, can be one of the causes for moral injury. And so they have this sense of moral hurt that, we're doing this work and we're getting pilloried, we're getting hammered for it. Even politicians, responsible politicians, powerful politicians are going after them. And that adds to the sense of moral hurt and moral outrage. So yes, you see it, a classic example is one you just raised.
I have my question of my own. I just wanted to ask today, World Mental Health Day, and the theme this year is workplaces. I just wonder, I was talking yesterday about sort of toxic workplaces and how newsrooms can often be not very supportive places, and wonder how that kind of relates to the whole question of moral injury and moral courage. The sort of moral transgression not happening necessarily in what you witness, but in what's happening behind the scenes in the newsroom.
Absolutely, I think that's quite right. So when we developed the moral injury scale, and we boiled it down to 9 key questions to ask, 2 related to online harassment, but there are a group of questions related to the relationship between the journalist and the newsroom. Because journalists see that at times editors and news organizations get things morally wrong. You speak about this toxic work environment as a classic example of it. You can have news organizations sending people to do the most dangerous work and not providing adequate support for them. That's morally egregious behavior. So you can see where there are multiple sources of moral hurt. Now, you don't want to expand it too much because, life's not straightforward. Life's difficult. It comes with stresses and challenges. Not everything's going to be a source of moral injury. But within the intensity of a newsroom, you can certainly understand how this takes root. If you don't feel you're supported by your editors, if you feel that your editors have made the wrong call, a morally incorrect call, it can lead to a real sense of alienation between the journalist and the news organization.
Emma, I feel we could talk for longer, but I think we're out of time now, aren't we? We went over a little bit already.
Yeah, so thank you very much, both of you. I'd just like to kind of repeat something we put on the screen a minute ago, a call from Olga Krutsova talking about a flash mob to say thank you to journalists. Well, I think we need a flash mob to say thank you to you both. So please, anybody, you're welcome to to be a flash mob of thanks to Anthony, and this was, you know, really a very fascinating conversation that I think we could carry on for a long time. And Michelle, thank you very much for you know, prompting such an interesting discussion. So I'm going to say goodbye to both of you now, and then just give a quick overview of what's still coming up on day 3 of the Mental Health in Journalism Summit. So these are the sessions that are just about to happen at the top of the hour. We've got 4 sessions going on at the same time and going on throughout the rest of the day, also in Spanish later on. So it's a lot to choose from. I'd like to give a particular call out to session 3, which is about the staying true to your health and the fact checking industry, because I've been involved in that project. But there's so many great things to choose from. And just let me go to my next slide. Yeah, so first of all, if you haven't done so already, you need to sign up at this website to access those sessions. Most of them are being held on Zoom, so you need to go through this website to sign up. And then once you've done that, you'll get to a screen that looks like this. Once you get to this screen, you need to click on the session that you're interested in attending. And then once you've clicked on it, you'll get this drop-down menu, and then you get the chance to go into the Zoom. So you click on the Zoom link. It's a few steps, but once you're in, it's very easy to use. So that's the sessions that are coming up. Also, just to say that there will be recordings of the sessions. So this session's being recorded on YouTube, but the sessions on Zoom, many of them are also being recorded. You need to pre-register to access the recordings that will become available in the next few days. Just to finish up, to say thank you very much for joining us. This is the Self-Investigation YouTube channel. You can also subscribe to see, you know, to see these speeches that we've had in the last few days, but also to follow the work of the Self-Investigation going forward. So thank you very much. Please join us for the sessions that are coming up shortly, and thank you for all your comments and your engagement in this session. And we'll be seeing you later on, hopefully on those Zoom calls.